everybody, welcome back to the channel. My name is Repeat Ron, and today we're going to be doing a tier list, and this is going to be a horror movie tier list again, and this is going to be taking a look at all of the Saw movies. I just recently watched Saw Spiral yesterday, so let's talk about each of them, where I would rank them, and then maybe we'll do another list of the Saw traps later on, or maybe even the Saw characters. We'll see how this one goes, and tell me your thoughts down in the comments below as to if you would like to see any of those. So let's begin and start out with Saw 1. Now, Saw 1, I remember watching, I think I was probably in middle school the first time I watched it, or maybe elementary school, I'm not entirely sure. I remember it coming out, and I remember a lot of people telling me how gory and gross the first Saw was, which it's really not. The first Saw has a very good way of being ominous and creepy all throughout it, without particularly showing a whole lot, and it was a low-budget movie for the time. It still got some very odd choices for some of the editing that they did, and some of the other choices that they made. I know it was a low-budget movie for the time. They didn't have a lot of money. The traps, honestly, there's only a few that are actually pretty memorable in this one. The other ones aren't really that great. I remember them. The most memorable one was the reverse bear trap that's on Amanda's head, but you don't actually get to see that function in the first Saw, at least not on a human head. The bathroom trap is another pretty iconic one. All the other ones aren't really one of the best ones, though. Like the razor wire cage, I understand why they did it. Again, low budget, and it's just, what they're doing, but it's not anything super special, I would say. It's not something like super gory or gross like how it got on into some of the later Saw movies. Same with the room with the guy covered in flammable substances with glass all over. Not one of my favorites. We've got a extremely memorable ending and a pretty good setup for a horror movie. I really like the first Saw. It does have problems, but I would probably put the very first Saw into the A tier. I don't think it goes to S tier because, like I said, it has quite a few glaring problems. Maybe I would probably put the premise of Saw up into S tier, but the execution of it probably lower. So I think A tier is where it belongs. It's a pretty good horror movie, and if anybody is interested in watching the Saw series but may be kind of hesitant because of all the blood and gore that they've heard of, the first one really doesn't have that much blood and gore in it. And I would definitely recommend you watch it. It is still a horror movie. It is more of a thriller and a mystery movie as well. Much more so than just a straightforward slasher movie or just a gore fest. It really isn't those things. It would later become those things, though. So let's talk about the next one in the series. This is Saw 2. So after the events of Saw 1, we are back and we have some familiar faces in this one. We have Amanda from part 1, as well as Tobin Bell still playing Jigsaw in this one, which is great. I feel like that might be a minor spoiler. For anybody that's not aware of the Saw series, there will be a couple spoilers throughout this. This one, like a lot of the other Saw movies, is split into pretty much two parts, two different stories that are going on simultaneously. One with the victims inside the house trying to get out of the house. They have poison injected into them. I believe it was poison injected into them, and poison being pumped in. They need to get the antidotes to survive. Well, we're also following the cops that are trying to find and save these people. Now, this one also introduces Donnie Wahlberg into it, who is a interesting character, I would say, of the Saw movies, and probably one of the more memorable ones. You get to see some really gross traps in this one, honestly. It's still not incredibly graphic compared to some of the later installments of Saw. Probably the most memorable trap in this one, I would say, is the needle pit. Most people really don't like that scene, and I can understand why. This one, again, has a pretty solid story to it. It's got pretty decent characters. It's got some gory traps. It's getting more into that territory. This one doesn't have as many weird edits in it. This one's a much more straightforward movie, and I believe that's probably because you had a bigger budget for this one because the first Saw was such a huge success. So Saw 2 naturally would get more money, and it does overall look better. I also still really enjoy pretty much everything about this one. This one I would say is on par with the original Saw, potentially even better than it, so I'm also going to put this one into A tier. Now, the third Saw, we're getting a little bit off, I would say, compared to the first two movies. It's now been revealed at the end of part 2 that Amanda is working with John Kramer, so we have two Jigsaw killers, at least as of right now. And we have another game going on. This one involving a guy named Jeff. So we're going through his traps, and this one is the longest Saw movie, I believe. I think this one is like 2.5-ish hours, and it kind of does feel like it. This one tends to drag at parts. This one, once again, has some interesting characters. Amanda and John are great, and some of the traps are rather memorable in this one. Some of them are pretty gross. Probably the most well-known trap from this one, or at least the most infamous trap from Part 3, is the rack towards the end of the movie, which that one is pretty gruesome, it's very simple, but it is very gruesome, and it works. Some of the other ones are a little bit weirder in this one, I find, and other ones I really like the idea of, but you don't necessarily see a lot of them. Like the shotgun collar sounds really cool, essentially little pipes or barrels attached to it with shotgun shells put in it, and just hammers connected to the outside, which seems really awesome and seems terrifying to have strapped to you, but we don't really get to see it, which is a little bit disappointing, and that kind of continues into some of the other movies. I would say Saw 3 is a step down from the other two Saws, and honestly not one of my favorite ones. It takes a bit too long to go through. It still has some redeeming things about it, though. I do still like Tobin Bell as Jigsaw. I do really like Amanda in this, and I would probably put Saw 3 into the C tier. It's a, solid average movie, in my opinion. Up next, we have Saw 4. Now, Saw 4 takes place kind of during and shortly after the events of Saw 3. So there are parts where it flashes back and parts where it's still going from Jeff's game in Part 3, as well as the events that are taking place with Amanda and John. And we do see the aftermath of this. And pretty big spoiler here, so if you haven't gotten this far into the Saw series and you really still want to watch them, we find out that John is completely dead. He is not coming back. He's very much dead. They did an autopsy at the very start of this. And we see the tape that he ate in Part 3 addressing the detective that is watching this. We also know that Amanda has now died in the end of Part 3 as well. So we're either going through another game that John already had going at the time, or there's another killer in this. And again, kind of a minor spoiler, there is another Jigsaw killer in this one. Now, this one follows one of the cops that we've seen in the background of quite a few of the other Saw movies, at least in 2 and 3. He was actually one of the better characters, I would say, in the Saw movies. I did enjoy him, and some of the traps in this one were, again, kind of memorable. Most notably, the last one with Donnie Wahlberg's character being strung up with the two metal arms that were holding the ice blocks. That one was really interesting. And the overall setup for this one was kind of interesting because you never really knew where it was going to go. And by the end, it's an okay ending, I would say. Mostly because, and again, spoilers here, because Hoffman, the detective, is the new Jigsaw killer, or one of John's other apprentices that was also helping them throughout Parts 2 and Part 3. But he's such a minor character in Parts 2 and Part 3 that I completely forgot about him, and I was very confused as to who the actual Jigsaw killer was by the end of this. It also has kind of an anticlimactic ending with the main characters, which was a bit upsetting. Overall, this one was, again, another okay one. It kind of had its ups and downs, and I would consider this one probably better than 3, and I think I'd put Saw 4 into B tier, because at least knowing where it's going to go kind of makes a bit more sense if you watch it again. Up next, we have Saw 5. This takes place, again, kind of during the events and after the events of 3 and 4, now that we know that Hoffman is the killer. And we have another detective trying to figure out the case and eventually finding out that it is Hoffman. And then both just kind of having a cat and mouse game. This one also has a group of people that are doing their own traps. This one feels like the most separate from one another because the cop story and the survivor or the victim story, I guess, don't really intersect until the very end, where it just happens to be that the cops are there at the end with the remaining survivors of the game that's going on. This one feels a bit weird. This one also has some pretty bad special effects in it. I remember, especially, I believe it's the very first kill that we see, or the first kill of the main group of people, looks really bad. It's poorly CG'd, and not way great there. Hoffman doesn't particularly make a great villain either, which is kind of disappointing because John made such a great villain, and I believe Amanda made such a great villain. John being so interesting and kind of full of himself at times, and Amanda being so psychotic and erratic, it made her interesting. Hoffman just seems like a regular slasher villain, and that's not really all that entertaining to watch. The main detective also isn't really that entertaining to watch in this one either. He kind of is just sort of there to drive the story home. We have some interesting traps. The main one that I find the most interesting is the table saw at the end, where you're supposed to put your hand in to give blood, but it was supposed to be a team event or something like that, and the survivors the survivors could have been survivors, but let's just say most of them didn't make it. So it has parts of that. We do see some flashbacks to Hoffman's backstory, which again aren't super interesting. We see some more parts with John in the background, which are kind of interesting. And we see some parts with Amanda, which are also kind of interesting. Ultimately, Saw 5 feels pretty weak compared to the other Saw movies, and it's one of my least favorite, I would say. It's probably... I'd probably put it in the low end of C tier. I'm not sure if I'd give it a D tier ranking, just because there is some decent stuff that happens in it. Up next is Saw 6. The police are starting to put it together that Hoffman might be the killer and is probably the killer by the middle to end of this story. We get kind of another disconnected victim to police story. So we follow the police, which is Hoffman usually going around and trying to kill people in all of his different ways. And then the story of a business executive trying to go through his own trials. Now, this one does have some memorable traps in it, mostly the shotgun carousel and the final trap or execution at the end with the needles full of acid. That one is actually really cool and really gross. The shotgun carousel is also really cool and pretty terrifying. Some of the other traps are alright too. And we do get some interesting parts, like Hoffman having the reverse bear trap attached to his head. That is a pretty cool moment because we do actually get to see the bear trap go partially off. Again, kind of spoilers, Hoffman does survive this, and so he can continue on to the next story. I believe this one also had some very bizarre edits in it, like some of the chase scenes seeming like they don't take place at the same time or in the same location, and just some weird stuff like that. Overall, this one wasn't bad, though. I liked this one more than 3 or 5, I would say, and I'd probably put this one... I still don't think I'd put it into B tier, but I think I'm going to put it at the high end of C tier over these other two. And then we have the final Saw movie, or Saw 3D, Saw the Final Chapter. This one was supposed to end the series, where it then picked up later, like I believe it's 9 years later for Jigsaw, is in between the movie's length that they kind of held off from doing another one. Saw 3D kind of pulls out all the stops towards the end, where you see returning characters like Carrie Elwes' character from Part 1 coming back. You see some of the other characters we've seen in the previous Saw movies doing cameos that show up to like the Saw Survivor victims group. We know once again that Hoffman is the main villain of this, and he is aware that the police pretty much know that he is the new Jigsaw killer. So he's trying to pretty much eliminate as many people as he can. The game that we see go on honestly has nothing to do with Hoffman's story at all. It's just about a guy who faked being in the Jigsaw traps so that he could get notoriety, which then him and his crew of people that kind of helped him perpetuate this lie get put in the traps of this. And again, none of these traps really seem all that memorable, except for the final trap, which isn't really that great. It's the Brazen Bowl, for anybody that's not aware of that. It's essentially a contraption that you would put somebody in to then light a fire underneath it until they perish from burning to death, or boiling to death, as it would more likely be, or kind of baking them to death. We do get to see the reverse bear trap in action and kill somebody in this one. I believe it's this one, which is pretty cool. And we do get a pretty memorable ending to the callback of the original Saw's ending. All of those are great things about it. Everything else is pretty bad about this movie. The acting is pretty bad. The storytelling is pretty bad. We have a lot of inconsistencies through it. Hoffman becomes just straight up Michael Myers at a couple points in this movie. So it really goes off the rails. A lot of the traps, a lot of the CG is really bad. There's just a whole lot of really bad CG in this one. And this one's probably my least favorite one. Given that I said all those kind of nice things at the start, this one still is going to D tier. I do not like the Saw 3D, the Final Chapter one. Then we get on to the reboot / continuation / spin-off movies. Starting out with Jigsaw. Jigsaw takes place both before and after the events of the rest of the Saw movies. So part of it takes place before any of the other Saw movies, being John's first trap, I believe. So we do get to see Tobin Bell come back as Jigsaw, which is pretty awesome. And we also get to see the aftermath of all of this being recreated by the new Jigsaw killer. There is another Jigsaw killer. This one also being another apprentice, which is a little bit strange, because apparently John had 4 apprentices, maybe more, depending on how many more Saw movies we're going to get. And some of the traps in this one are actually really cool. I like that they toned down the gore in this one. There is still a decent amount of gore and violence in Jigsaw, but they did tone it down so that it kind of feels more like the original Saw, where it's mostly a mystery. Now, it is a pretty easy mystery to figure out who is the new Jigsaw killer. They don't do a great job at trying to mislead you or anything, because it's essentially down to 2 people within the first couple minutes of the movie. So it's not too hard to piece together who is going to be the new Jigsaw killer, and more than likely who is going to be the last victim. There is 2 traps in particular that stand out in Jigsaw, that being the Bucketheads trap, which I actually really like. That one is really iconic already, and looks amazing. And we also have the laser collar trap, which is another really cool looking trap. There is some kind of bad CGI in this one, or weird CGI in this one, at least through 2 of the traps. I believe everything else was mostly practical, or kind of glossed over with digital effects later on, and the practical effects look pretty good. There is some weird inconsistencies in the story, specifically the character motivations in it, which kind of bother me. There's also just some technical limitations that are kind of an issue too, like technology existing in the past when it really shouldn't have. And a lot of the setup is just kind of, you have to go with it, which I don't really have a problem with, because we have to have the horror story go, in a certain way. It has to hit certain beats. But even so, it does kind of take some stretches where it's like everything has to line up so well for everything else. And there is just kind of a lot of issues with Jigsaw. I like what they were trying to do with it, and that they were trying to change it a bit, but still kind of stay true to it. I like some of the callbacks to it, and it's not one of my least favorite Saw movies. I think I'd actually put this one in the low end of B tier, next to Saw 4. Again, like I said, I have problems with it, but I like certain other aspects of it, and I think it kind of belongs there. And our last movie here is Saw Spiral, or Spiral from the Book of Saw. So this one is not really trying to be with the other Saw movies. It's just taking place in the same world as the Saw movies. This one has Chris Rock and Samuel L. Jackson in it, where we're following Chris Rock, who is a detective who's trying to figure out who's killing the cops in his city, and Samuel L. Jackson is the former police chief, but also Chris Rock's father, who's also sort of helping him out in this regard. This one, again, didn't really choose to focus on the traps all that much, which I kind of enjoy. It did still have some gruesome and gross stuff in it, which is perfectly fine for the Saw series, but this one, I believe, tried to be more of a character study and follow the characters more closely. Now, that is probably the smartest idea that you could do with this type of movie, but I don't think it's written in a particularly great way. I do have some problems with the writing. I do have some problems with the ending in particular, where it just kind of seems like everything sort of just needs to fall in place and we need to have an ending. The other problem that I kind of had with it was the twist that they put at the end of this one really isn't much of a twist. You kind of see it coming from a mile away, especially once you figure out who the next killer is, and it's not hard to figure out because, well, here's kind of a spoiler, but it's the person that we haven't seen their trap scene with, but are presumed dead, when we got to see everybody else's trap scene and then find their body. Or find their body and then see their trap scene immediately after that. So not one of the greatest reveals by the end of this, as well as motivations I kind of had a problem with. The best part of this movie is Samuel L. Jackson, which sadly he is used very little in this movie, only being in a couple scenes with Chris Rock, and that honestly should have been the main focus of this movie, is Chris Rock and Samuel L. Jackson and their relationship with one another, as well as potentially going back to some of their memories and trying to figure this out. By the end of this, I was kind of bummed out because I pretty quickly figured out that We're probably not going to get Samuel L. Jackson in another Saw movie unless it's in flashbacks, which would be really awesome to see Samuel L. Jackson and Tobin Bell in the same movie. Well, some of the traps in this were kind of interesting, but I don't think any of them really stand out compared to the other Saw traps in other movies. If I was to pick the most memorable one, it might be the very first one that we see in the first couple minutes, being the subway tongue trap. I don't know what else to call that one. I thought Chris Rock did an okay job as the main character in this. I like Samuel L. Jackson, and it was an overall okay movie. I wouldn't say that it was anything fantastic, though. And I would probably put Saw Spiral also at the top of C tier. I think it's better than these other Saw movies. I don't think it's quite B tier yet, though. I think it's still kind of like C plus-ish area, where these other ones might be B minus area. And I think this is where I'd put all the Saw movies. I wouldn't put any of them into S tier because, honestly, all of them have problems to some extent. I would say the closest ones are the first two movies, Saw 1 and Saw 2. Those ones are probably the best, with most of the others being okay or serviceable. The only one I didn't really like was 3D, and plenty of other people don't really care for that one either. It's probably the weakest of the series, but if you want to watch the entire series, you're probably going to anyway. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this. Thank you guys so very much for watching it. If you guys like this video and you would like to see more of it, please leave that in the comments down below. I would love to do some more horror movie tier lists. These are always really fun to do, and they're really fun to talk about. Maybe I'll do some of them on stream at some point too. That could be really awesome. And thank you guys once again for watching this. If you guys did enjoy it, then be sure that you get subscribed. That way you get notifications whenever I post any of these videos. If you'd like to support the channel in other ways, you can by going down to the links below, either by joining the channel as a member on YouTube, going over to my Patreon. You can get early access to some of my videos there for just $1 a month. And you can also go down to the merch store and get some merch if you would like. We have some really cool stuff going on right now. And thanks everybody who does that. I really do appreciate it. Also, very special thanks to all of my current patrons and members. I really do appreciate that. You guys are awesome. And I will talk to all of you guys next time. Till then, stay cool and bye.